Get off my aircraft, now! The words sliced through the cabin of the $70 million Gulfstream G650 like a blade through silk. Captain Robert Garrison stood in the narrow aisle, his pale blue eyes locked onto the young black woman sitting in the owner's seat. His jaw set in a hard line of absolute authority. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She simply looked at him with the calm of someone who had already won a battle he didn't even know he was fighting. The cabin of the private jet, a sanctuary of cream leather and polished mahogany, had transformed into something else entirely. A pressure cooker, a courtroom, an arena where two worlds were about to collide with devastating consequences. Captain Garrison took another step forward, his silver-grey military haircut catching the soft cabin lights. At 58 years old, he had spent 35 years in the cockpit. He had flown presidents. He had flown princes. He had flown titans of industry whose names appeared on buildings and stock tickers around the world. He knew what wealth looked like. He knew what power looked like. And the woman sitting in front of him in her simple athletic leggings and cashmere hoodie, her hair pulled back in an elegant bun. No jewelry, no designer labels, no obvious markers of the extraordinary wealth required to charter this aircraft. She didn't fit the profile. "I've been flying for 35 years," Garrison continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've flown the most powerful people on this planet. I know what the clientele for a G650 looks like, and with all due respect, you don't fit the profile." Behind him, flight attendant Chloe Bennett stood frozen, her face a mask of barely concealed horror. First Officer Leo Martinez shifted his weight uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the captain and the passenger, sensing the catastrophe that was unfolding in real time. The woman in the owner's seat, Dr. Vivian Ashford, slowly uncrossed her legs. Her expression remained unchanged. Neutral, composed, almost serene. "I don't know who you are, or what your game is," Garrison pressed on, emboldened by her silence, mistaking her calm for submission. "But I'm not about to risk my license because some influencer's sugar daddy booked her a joyride and she got the tail number wrong." He crossed his arms, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. Victory was close. He could feel it. "Now I'm going to ask you one last time, nicely. Please gather your things and exit the aircraft." Dr. Vivian Ashford looked at him for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, heavy and absolute. Then she spoke, her voice low and even, carrying the weight of someone who had faced this exact scenario more times than she could count. "Captain," she said quietly, "you're about to make the biggest mistake of your career." What happened in the next 12 minutes would destroy Robert Garrison's 35-year career, obliterate his reputation, end his marriage, and become a cautionary tale whispered in every private aviation lounge from the snow-capped peaks of Aspen to the glittering towers of Dubai. But he didn't know that yet. He stood there in the aisle of that $70 million aircraft arm, crossed smirk in place, absolutely convinced that he was the one in control. He had no idea that the woman he was trying to throw off this jet was the very person who held the lease to it. He had no idea that he was standing in her kingdom. And he had no idea that she was about to show him exactly what happens when you try to throw the queen out of her own castle. But before we dive into this incredible story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been judged before you even opened your mouth? Have you ever walked into a room and felt someone decide you didn't belong? Just by looking at you, have you ever seen someone's eyes sweep over you, head to toe, and watched them reach a conclusion about your worth, your status, your right to be there, all in the space of a single heartbeat? If you have, then this story is for you. And if you haven't, then pay close attention. Because what you're about to witness is a masterclass in what happens when prejudice meets power, when arrogance meets accountability, and when a man who thought he was untouchable discovers that he was standing on very, very thin ice. Before we continue, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. Whether you're in Atlanta, London, Lagos, Tokyo, or Los Angeles, whether you're watching this at midnight or on your lunch break. I want to hear from you. This story belongs to all of us. And if you believe that dignity doesn't depend on fitting someone's profile, if you believe that respect should be given freely and not rationed based on appearance, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell. Because stories like this need to be heard. Stories like this need to be shared. And stories like this need to remind the world that the old rules are changing. Now let's rewind. Let's go back 45 minutes before that confrontation in the cabin. Back to Aspen, Colorado. Back to a sun-drenched tarmac where the air is thin and crisp, where money whispers and power shouts, and where a decorated pilot was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. The lesson, be careful who you dismiss. Be careful who you underestimate. Because you might just be trying to throw the Queen out of her own castle. This is the story of Dr. Vivian Ashford and Captain Robert Garrison. This is pilot orders black woman off private jet, then freezes when he realizes she owns the lease. Let's begin. The air in Aspen, Colorado is different. At nearly 8,000 feet above sea level, it's thin and crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and fresh mountain snow. It's the kind of air that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive, the kind of air that whispers of adventure and possibility and the rarefied existence of those who can afford to breathe it. It was in this atmosphere on a pristine afternoon in late September that Dr. Vivian Ashford stood on the tarmac of Aspen-Pitkin County Airport, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a deal well done. The negotiations had been grueling. 3 days of corporate maneuvering of lawyers and spreadsheets and conference rooms with views of the Rocky Mountains. 3 days of intense focus of strategic patience, of knowing when to push and when to pull back. And now, finally, it was over. Nexus Dynamics. The biotech company she had built from a small laboratory startup into a $2 billion enterprise had just acquired Meridian Therapeutics, a promising firm specializing in cellular regeneration technology. The acquisition would accelerate Nexus's gene therapy research by at least 3 years. It would bring 47 new patents under their umbrella. It would position them to potentially cure 2 different types of hereditary blindness within the decade. Vivian allowed herself a small smile as she walked across the tarmac toward the gleaming white and silver Gulfstream G650 that waited for her. The afternoon sun glinted off its fuselage, transforming the aircraft into something almost celestial, a chariot of the gods parked on ordinary asphalt. At 34 years old, Dr. Vivian Ashford was a paradox in the world she inhabited. In the scientific community, she was a titan. A PhD in biomedical engineering from MIT, where she had graduated at the top of her class at 23. A researcher whose patented innovations in cellular regeneration were changing the face of modern medicine. A mind so brilliant that her doctoral thesis had been cited over 4,000 times in peer-reviewed journals around the world. In the business world, she was a force of nature. A CEO who had taken her company from a cramped laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to a gleaming headquarters in Boston's Seaport District. A leader who commanded the respect of venture capitalists, board members, and competitors alike. A strategist whose instincts had guided Nexus through 3 successful funding rounds and 1 spectacularly successful Series C that had valued the company at over $1 billion. But to the casual observer, to someone who didn't know her name, her credentials, her net worth, she was unassuming. Today she wore no power suit, no Hermes scarf, no Cartier watch, no flashy jewelry that screamed wealth and demanded attention. Instead, she was dressed for comfort on the long flight back to Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. Charcoal gray Lululemon leggings that moved with her body. a simple white long-sleeved tee that felt soft against her skin. An exquisitely soft oatmeal-colored cashmere hoodie that she had owned for years and couldn't bear to replace. Her hair was pulled back into a simple, elegant bun. On her feet were a pair of comfortable yet stylish sneakers. She carried a well-worn leather satchel containing her laptop and a thick sheath of papers dense with scientific data. The research summaries from the Meridian acquisition that she planned to review on the flight home. She looked less like a corporate titan who had just closed a $400 million deal and more like a graduate student heading home for the holidays. And that was exactly how she liked it. Vivian had learned long ago that the people who needed to broadcast their wealth were usually the ones who feared losing it. Real power didn't announce itself with designer labels and ostentatious displays. Real power simply existed. It moved through the world quietly, confidently, secure in its own foundation. She had nothing to prove to anyone. The Gulfstream G650 that waited for her on the tarmac was in many ways the embodiment of that philosophy. It was the single biggest business expense she had ever approved, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. A 5-year exclusive lease through Apex Aviation, one of the top charter management companies in the world, gave her complete control over the aircraft. She could call for it at a moment's notice. She could fly to Zurich one day and San Francisco the next. She could take meetings at 30,000 feet reviewing documents and making calls while crossing continents. In her line of work, time was the one commodity she could never create more of. She could only save it. And this jet, this $70 million machine with its twin Rolls-Royce engines and its intercontinental range, saved her hundreds of hours every year. Hours she could spend in her laboratory. Hours she could spend with her team. Hours she could spend pushing the boundaries of what was medically possible. The lease cost approximately $4 million per year. It was a staggering sum by any normal standard. But for a company generating the revenue that Nexus Dynamics generated, it was a rounding error, an investment in efficiency, a tool like any other tool that served a purpose. She didn't own the jet. That was an important distinction. Apex Aviation owned the aircraft and was responsible for its maintenance, its crew, its insurance, and its hangar fees. What Vivian owned was the lease, the exclusive right to use the aircraft whenever she needed it for the next 5 years. For all practical purposes, this Gulfstream G650 tail number N4227A was hers. As she approached the aircraft, the jet's stairs unfolded with a soft hydraulic hiss extending down to the tarmac like a red carpet rolled out for royalty. At the top of the stairs stood a smiling young woman in an impeccable uniform, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her posture professional and welcoming. Chloe Bennett, 28 years old, one of the best flight attendants Apex Aviation had on staff. She had been the regular attendant on Vivian's flights for the past 6 months, and in that time she had proven herself to be intelligent, intuitive, and genuinely kind. "Good afternoon, Dr. Ashford," Chloe said warmly as Vivian reached the top of the stairs. Her greeting was practiced but genuine, the kind of warmth that came from actually enjoying her work. "Congratulations on closing the deal." "We heard the news." Vivian smiled, feeling some of the tension from the past 3 days begin to melt away. "Thank you, Chloe. It was a tough one. I can only imagine." Chloe reached out to take Vivian's satchel, handling it with care. "I have your chamomile tea ready for you as soon as we're in the air. The cabin is set to your preferred temperature, and I've prepared the light meal you requested. You're a lifesaver." Vivian stepped into the cabin, and the world outside the tarmac, the mountains, the negotiations, the stress, all of it seemed to fall away. The interior of the Gulfstream was a masterpiece of bespoke luxury. Cream leather seats that seemed to embrace you when you sat down. Dark, polished mahogany tables and trim that gleamed under the soft lighting. Brushed steel accents that added a touch of modern elegance to the classic design. This was her sanctuary. her office, her time machine. She settled into her favorite seat, the one positioned near the window, with the best view and the most legroom, and let out a long, slow breath. The tension from the past 72 hours began to melt away. The lawyers, the spreadsheets, the conference rooms with their uncomfortable chairs and their endless cups of bad coffee, all of it receded into the background. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit wash over her like a soothing lullaby. In a few hours, she would be back in New Jersey. She could sleep in her own bed. She could wake up tomorrow and get back to the work that truly mattered, the research, the science, the pursuit of cures that could change millions of lives. But first, she would rest. She would drink her chamomile tea. She would review the Meridian research summaries, and she would let this beautiful machine carry her home. She had no idea in that moment of peaceful anticipation that the next few minutes would change everything. She had no idea that a confrontation was coming that would test her composure, challenge her dignity, and ultimately transform her from a quiet titan of industry into a symbol of something much larger. She had no idea that a man named Robert Garrison was about to walk through that cabin door and make the biggest mistake of his life. Chloe was just securing the satchel in a forward closet, humming softly to herself, when two figures appeared at the cabin door. They were the pilots, and the moment they stepped into the cabin, the energy shifted. The first figure was a younger man, early 30s, with dark hair and warm brown eyes. First Officer Leo Martinez gave Vivian a professional nod and a slight smile as he entered. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice respectful and even. Behind him was the captain. And Captain Robert Garrison was something else entirely. Captain Robert Garrison looked like a man who had been carved from granite and aviation fuel. He was in his late 50s, with a stern, weathered face that spoke of decades spent at high altitude, of countless sunrises viewed from 30,000 feet, of a life lived in the thin air between the clouds. His silver-grey hair was cut in a severe military style, short and precise, not a strand out of place. His jaw was set in a permanent expression of command, and his pale blue eyes seemed to be constantly scanning for threats, for problems, for anything that didn't fit his carefully ordered world-view. His uniform was immaculate. His posture was rigid. His presence filled the cabin in a way that demanded attention, that demanded respect, that demanded deference. His name tag read Robert Garrison. Vivian had never flown with him before. Her usual captain, a pleasant man named Thomas, was on a family emergency, his wife having gone into early labor with their first child. Garrison had been assigned as a last-minute replacement, a senior captain from Apex's roster who happened to be available and qualified for the G650. In hindsight, that scheduling decision would prove to be catastrophically expensive. Garrison's pale blue eyes swept the cabin as he entered the practiced gaze of a pilot taking in his domain. The cream leather seats, the polished mahogany, the soft lighting. And then his eyes landed on Vivian, sitting in the owner's seat dressed in her athletic wear, her hair in a simple bun, no jewelry, no obvious markers of wealth. And they stopped. Something shifted in his expression. The professional command that had characterized his face a moment before narrowed into something else. Something colder. Something that Vivian recognized immediately because she had seen it countless times before in her life. Suspicion. Judgment. Dismissal. In that fraction of a second, Captain Robert Garrison looked at Dr. Vivian Ashford and made a decision. He saw a young black woman in casual clothes sitting in a seat that cost more per hour than most people made in a month. He saw athletic leggings instead of a designer suit. He saw a simple bun instead of an expensive salon hairstyle. He saw sneakers instead of Louboutins. And he decided that she didn't belong. He didn't see the PhD from MIT. He didn't see the $2 billion company. He didn't see the $400 million deal she had just closed. He didn't see the brilliant mind that had revolutionized cellular regeneration research. He didn't see the leader, the innovator, the titan. He saw a problem. He didn't speak to Vivian. He directed his words to Chloe instead, his voice a low growl that cut through the cabin's tranquility like a knife. "Chloe. Who is this?" Chloe, caught off guard, blinked in surprise. She had been closing the overhead closet, her back to the cabin, and she turned now to face the captain with an expression of confusion. "Captain, this is Dr. Ashford." She said, her tone professional but uncertain, sensing that something was wrong but not quite sure what. "Our passenger." Garrison's eyes flicked back to Vivian. His expression didn't change. He looked at her the way a security guard might look at someone who had wandered into a restricted area with barely concealed contempt and absolute certainty that she didn't belong. He ignored Chloe's introduction as if it were an irrelevant piece of static, as if the words had simply bounced off him without making any impact whatsoever. He took a step further into the cabin, his posture radiating an intimidating authority, the kind of authority that expected to be obeyed without question, the kind of authority that was accustomed to deference, to submission to people scrambling to please him. "I think there's been a mistake," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. His lips curved into something that might have been a smile on a different face, but on his it was a sneer. "Are you with the ground crew or the catering service? Sometimes they come on board to do a final check." He paused, letting his words hang in the air like an accusation. "If you're finished, you need to deplane now. We're preparing for departure." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. It settled over the cabin like a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. Chloe's friendly smile froze on her face, transforming into an expression of barely concealed horror. Leo Martinez, standing behind the captain, shifted his weight uncomfortably, his eyes widening as he processed what was happening. Vivian, who had been sinking into a state of blissful relaxation just moments before, opened her eyes. She met the captain's steely gaze without a flicker of emotion. Her face was calm, composed, utterly neutral. But inside she felt a familiar sensation, a cold flash of recognition that ran through her veins like ice water. This wasn't the first time someone had looked at her and decided she didn't belong. It wasn't the first time someone had seen her skin color, her age, her gender, and immediately categorized her as less than. It wasn't the first time she had been mistaken for the help, for the assistant, for someone's girlfriend or wife or daughter, for anyone other than the person actually in charge. It had happened in laboratories. It had happened in boardrooms. It had happened at conferences and networking events and fundraising dinners. It had happened so many times in so many places that she had lost count. But it had never happened quite like this. It had never been this blatant, this aggressive, this unapologetically hostile. "I believe you misheard the flight attendant?" Vivian said, her voice calm, level, and utterly devoid of the anger that was beginning to coil in her stomach like a snake preparing to strike. "I am the passenger, Dr. Vivian Ashford." She held his gaze as she spoke, her eyes steady, her expression neutral. She gave him no satisfaction. She showed him no weakness. She simply stated the facts clearly and precisely, and waited for him to correct his mistake. But Captain Robert Garrison was not a man who corrected his mistakes. His lips curled into a semblance of a smile, but it was a cold thing, dismissive and arrogant. The smile of a man who believed he knew better, who believed he could see through deceptions that fooled lesser minds, who believed that his 35 years of experience had given him an infallible ability to judge people at a glance. "Right," he said, drawing the word out with obvious skepticism. "The manifest says this flight is for V." "Ashford," he paused, letting his eyes sweep over her once more, taking in her athletic wear, her simple appearance, her lack of obvious wealth markers. "I'm guessing that's your father, or your husband. Is he running late?" The assumption was so blatant, so rooted in a worldview that Vivian had fought against her entire life that she felt a second flash of ice run through her veins. But this time, it wasn't just recognition. It was something harder, something colder. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a simple mistake that could be cleared up with a quick explanation. This was a judgment, a conclusion that this man had reached before she had spoken a single word, a verdict rendered based on nothing more than the color of her skin and the clothes on her back. "There is no Mr. Ashford," she stated, her voice losing its warmth and taking on a harder, more precise edge. Each word was delivered with the clinical precision of a surgeon making an incision. "The V stands for Vivian. The aircraft is chartered for me." She paused, letting her words sink in, giving him one final chance to recognize his error. "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to settle in. We have a long flight." She turned her head to look out the window, a clear and unmistakable signal that the conversation was over. The gesture was polite, but firm, the kind of dismissal that a person of authority gives to someone who has overstepped their bounds. It was the same gesture she used in boardrooms when a subordinate had wasted too much of her time. It was a closing of the door, a drawing of the line, a final word that expected no response. But Captain Robert Garrison was not a man who accepted dismissal. He was not a man who ceded control, especially not to someone he had already categorized and rejected. In his mind, he was the pilot in command. In his mind, his word was law on this aircraft. In his mind, he was the king of this silver-winged kingdom, and no one, absolutely no one, was going to sit in the throne without his permission. He took another step forward, placing himself directly in her line of sight, blocking her view of the window. His body language was aggressive now, confrontational. The thin veneer of professional courtesy had cracked, revealing something uglier beneath. "Listen," he said, and his tone had shifted from condescending to openly hostile. "I've been flying for 35 years. I've flown presidents. I've flown princes. I've flown titans of industry. I know what the clientele for a G650 looks like." He leaned forward slightly, his pale blue eyes boring into hers. "And with all due respect, you don't fit the profile." The insult was so direct, so blatant, so breathtakingly offensive, that for a moment the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Chloe gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Leo took a half-step forward, his expression alarmed, his mouth opening as if to speak. Captain Leo began, his voice tight with tension. "I don't think—" But Garrison shot him a look that silenced him instantly. A look that said, "You will not question me." A look that said, "I am the authority here." A look that had probably silenced countless subordinates over the past 35 years. Leo fell silent, but his eyes remained troubled. His jaw tightened. Something was shifting in his expression, a calculation being made, a line being drawn. Vivian slowly turned her full attention back to the pilot. The calm facade remained firmly in place, but behind her eyes a storm was gathering. Her voice, when she spoke, was dangerously quiet. The profile she repeated, letting the word hang in the air between them. "Please, Captain, enlighten me. What exactly is the profile you're referring to?" It was a trap, and Garrison walked right into it. "Let's not play games," he sneered. "This flight costs over $100,000. I'm not about to risk my license and my reputation because some influencer's sugar daddy booked her a joyride and she got the tail number wrong." The words landed like grenades in the quiet cabin. Sugar daddy, influencer, joyride, got the tail number wrong. In a single sentence he had reduced her to nothing. A gold digger, a kept woman, someone's plaything who had wandered onto the wrong aircraft by mistake. He had looked at everything she was, everything she had accomplished, everything she had built, and he had dismissed it all. He had erased it all. He had replaced it with his own narrative, his own assumptions, his own deeply ingrained prejudices. Chloe looked like she might be sick. Leo's face had gone pale. And in the rear of the cabin, in a seat that Garrison hadn't bothered to check, a woman named Elena Vega sat very, very still. Elena was 28 years old, a tech journalist for a prominent online publication traveling to New York for a conference on emerging technologies. She had been seated at the back of the cabin when the pilots entered, reviewing notes on her laptop, paying little attention to the routine of pre-flight preparations. But she was paying attention now. Her phone was in her hand, and for the past 2 minutes since the moment Garrison had asked, "Who is this?" in that contemptuous tone she had been recording, her thumb hovered over the share button. Her eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding before her, and her mind was already composing the post that would soon set the internet on fire. The cabin of the Gulfstream G650 was designed for tranquility. Every element of its interior had been engineered to insulate its occupants from the chaos of the outside world, from the roar of the engines, from the turbulence of the atmosphere, from the ordinary stresses of travel. The cream leather seats absorbed sound. The thick carpeting muffled footsteps. The triple-paned windows blocked out the noise of the tarmac. But in that moment, the cabin was anything but tranquil. The silence crackled with unspoken tension. The air itself seemed to have thickened, making it harder to breathe. Every person in that confined space could feel the weight of what was happening, the magnitude of the confrontation that was unfolding. Captain Robert Garrison stood in the center of the aisle, his arms crossed over his chest, his face flushed with the righteous certainty of a man who believed he was protecting his aircraft from an intruder. His pale blue eyes were fixed on Vivian with an intensity that bordered on hostile. His posture radiated authority, intimidation, the unshakable confidence of someone who had spent 35 years giving orders and having them obeyed. "Now I'm going to ask you one last time nicely," he said, his voice low and hard. "Please gather your things and exit the aircraft." He uncrossed his arms, letting them hang at his sides in a gesture that was somehow more threatening than his previous posture. His fingers flexed slightly, as if he was preparing for physical confrontation. "You have 30 seconds to get off my aircraft under your own power. If you refuse, I will call airport security and have you removed for trespassing." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke. Chloe Bennett stood frozen near the forward galley, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. She had been a flight attendant for 6 years. She had dealt with difficult passengers, delayed flights, medical emergencies, turbulence that had sent beverage carts flying through the cabin. But she had never in all her years of service witnessed anything like this. Her job was to provide impeccable service. Her training had taught her to de-escalate situations, to smooth over conflicts, to make every passenger feel valued and welcome. But now she was trapped between her duty to the client and the unyielding command of the captain. Her mouth opened and closed, words failing her. "Captain, please," she finally managed, her voice soft and pleading. "I can re-verify her credentials with the FBO. It will only take a moment. Just let me make a quick call and—" "Stay out of this, Chloe." Garrison didn't even glance at her. He didn't grace her with so much as a look. His focus was entirely on Vivian Predator, zeroing in on prey. In his mind, this was his aircraft. In his mind, his word was law. In his mind, he had identified a threat, and he was dealing with it the way he had been trained to deal with threats, with authority, with force, with the absolute certainty that he was right. He took another step closer to Vivian, invading her space, using his physical presence as a weapon. "I don't know who you are," he repeated, his voice rising in volume, echoing in the confined space. "I don't know what your game is, but it ends now. 30 seconds. Starting now." Leo Martinez felt cold sweat prickle the back of his neck. He had been with Apex Aviation for 2 years, working his way up from regional jets to the prestigious position of first officer on the company's most exclusive aircraft. He knew the golden rules of private aviation. The client was sacrosanct. The client was always right. The client was the reason they had jobs, the reason they had salaries, the reason they could afford their mortgages and their car payments and their children's educations. He had seen Captain Garrison be gruff before. The man was old school, a classic hard-nosed pilot who viewed flight attendants as minor functionaries and first officers as barely tolerable apprentices. He commanded respect through intimidation, through the weight of his experience, through the force of his personality. But this was different. This was a violation. Leo looked at the passenger, Dr. Ashford, sitting there in her seat. He saw her stillness a stark contrast to Garrison's aggressive posture. He saw the look in her eyes, and it wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was something else entirely. It was a profound, chilling disappointment. The disappointment of someone who had been through this before. The disappointment of someone who had hoped, perhaps against hope, that this time would be different. The disappointment of someone who had built a life, a career, a legacy only to have it dismissed, erased, invalidated by a stranger in a uniform who couldn't see past the color of her skin. "Captain Garrison!" Leo's voice cut through the tension. It was firm, but respectful, the voice of a subordinate who was trying to navigate a minefield. "The flight plan was confirmed this morning. The passenger is verified. Dr. Vivian Ashford. Everything is in order. I checked the manifest myself." He stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Garrison and Vivian, a subtle gesture of intervention. "Perhaps there's been some confusion with the paperwork. We could contact dispatch, get a confirmation. Are you questioning my authority?" Martinez Garrison rounded on him, his face flushing with fury. The veins in his neck stood out like cords. His pale blue eyes blazed with an anger that seemed disproportionate, excessive, almost unhinged. "I am the pilot in command," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "My word is law on this aircraft. I am responsible for the safety and security of this flight. And something about this situation feels wrong." He jabbed a finger toward Vivian. "I'm making a command decision. She goes. Now!" Leo held his ground. He didn't back down, didn't look away, didn't submit to the intimidation. But he also knew that pushing further would only escalate the situation. Garrison was not a man who responded well to being challenged, especially not in front of others, especially not by someone he considered a subordinate. "Understood," Captain Leo said quietly. But as he stepped back, his eyes met Vivian's for just a moment. And in that brief exchange something passed between them. An acknowledgement, a recognition, a silent message that said, "I see what's happening. I know this is wrong." Vivian watched the exchange with the same cool, analytical precision she applied to complex biochemical equations. She understood the dynamics at play. She understood that Leo was trapped, caught between his own conscience and the hierarchical structure of his profession. She understood that Chloe was paralyzed, torn between her training and her humanity. She understood that she was alone in this cabin with a man whose prejudice was so deep, so ingrained, that no amount of explanation would penetrate it. She could have escalated. She could have raised her voice, matched his aggression, demanded to be treated with respect. She could have pulled out her phone and shown him her Forbes profile, her Wikipedia page, her company's website with her picture prominently displayed on the leadership team section. She could have recited her net worth, her credentials, her list of accomplishments. But she knew with the certainty of someone who had navigated these waters many times before that it would be pointless. A man this steeped in his own prejudice would not be swayed by facts he didn't want to believe. He would see any evidence she presented as a desperate gambit, further proof of some elaborate deception. He would double down, dig in, refuse to admit that he had made a mistake. His ego would never allow it. His worldview would never permit it. She had to bypass him entirely. She had to go to the source. Vivian held Garrison's gaze for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, heavy with tension, electric with possibility. He stood there, arms at his sides, confident smirk beginning to form on his face. He thought he had won. He thought his ultimatum had worked. He thought the imposter was about to back down and slink away. Then, in a move that completely disarmed him, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "All right, Captain," she said, her voice even calm, almost agreeable. Garrison's smirk widened. Victory! He had stared down the imposter and she had blinked. His authority had been challenged and his authority had prevailed. This was how the world worked. This was how it had always worked. This was how it would always work. A wise decision, he said, smugly triumph, dripping from every syllable. But Vivian wasn't reaching for her satchel. Instead, she slowly reached into the pocket of her cashmere hoodie and retrieved her iPhone. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, almost leisurely. She swiped through her contacts with her thumb, scrolling past names that would have made Garrison's blood run cold if he could have seen them. Venture capitalists, senators, CEOs, the kind of people who shaped the world from corner offices and private clubs. Her thumb stopped on one name, David Morrison, Apex CEO. Garrison watched her, his brow furrowing in confusion. The smirk was still there, but it was beginning to falter at the edges. Calling for a ride, he asked, his voice carrying a note of mockery. "Good. The sooner you're off the property, the better." Vivian ignored him. She pressed the call button and put the phone to her ear. It rang once. In the rear of the cabin, Elena Vega was still recording. Her phone had captured everything, every word, every gesture, every moment of escalating confrontation. Her thumb moved from the share button to her social media app. She began composing a post, her fingers flying across the screen. "Just watched a pilot try to throw a black woman off a private jet because she doesn't fit the profile. The confidence of this man is unreal." At Apex Aviation care to explain #profile this. She attached the first 30 seconds of video and hit post. By the time the call connected, the video was already spreading. David Vivian said into the phone, her tone suddenly shifting from that of a passenger to that of an executive speaking to a subordinate. Her voice carried weight authority, the unmistakable timbre of someone accustomed to being in charge. "Vivian Ashford here. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." On the other end of the line, in a corner office on the 50th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, David Morrison straightened in his chair. He was the CEO and founder of Apex Aviation, a man who had built one of the most prestigious private charter companies in the world from a single leased aircraft and a dream. He was in the middle of a tense quarterly review surrounded by executives and spreadsheets and projections. But when Vivian Ashford called, he took the call. He always took the call. Because Nexus Dynamics wasn't just a client. They were the client. Their 5-year exclusive lease was one of the largest contracts on Apex's books, worth over $20 million when you factored in flight hours, fuel costs, crew salaries, and management fees. Dr. Ashford herself was the kind of client that every charter company dreamed of: sophisticated, low-maintenance, loyal, and connected to a network of other potential clients who could generate millions in referral business. She was, without exaggeration, the single most important client David Morrison had. Vivian, his voice came through clear and professional, warm with the familiarity of a long-standing business relationship. "Not at all, it's always a pleasure to hear from you. Is everything all right? I thought you were wheels up from Aspen an hour ago." Back in the cabin of the Gulfstream, Garrison's expression was beginning to change. The smug confidence was draining from his face, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. His eyes moved from Vivian to the phone. Trying to process what was happening, trying to understand why this woman was making a phone call instead of gathering her things and leaving. Who was she calling? A lawyer? A boyfriend? Someone who would come pick her up? He crossed his arms again, but the gesture felt less authoritative now, more defensive. That's what I'm calling about. David. Vivian continued. Her gaze locked on Garrison, watching his reaction with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. There seems to be a delay. We have an issue here on the ground with your pilot. She paused, letting the words sink in, letting them travel through the phone across the miles to the corner office in Manhattan. A Captain Garrison, I believe. At the mention of his name, Garrison's face went pale. His heart stuttered in his chest. David Morrison. She had called David Morrison. She knew David Morrison. She knew the CEO of Apex Aviation well enough to have his direct number in her phone, well enough to call him by his first name, well enough to interrupt his day with a casual phone call about a delay. The pieces began to fall into place, slowly, horribly, like dominoes toppling in slow motion. He seems to be under the impression that I don't belong on this aircraft, Vivian continued, her voice calm, measured, almost conversational. In fact, he's just threatened to have me forcibly removed by airport security. The silence on the other end of the phone was brief but profound. When David Morrison spoke again, his voice had lost all its warmth. It was cold now, hard, razor-sharp, the voice of a man who had built an empire and would not tolerate threats to it. Vivian, he said, his tone flat with controlled fury. I want you to give the phone to the captain. Right now. Vivian held the phone out to Garrison, her face a mask of perfect neutrality. Not triumphant, not smug, just calm, just waiting. Mr. Morrison would like a word with you, Captain. For the first time since he had entered the cabin, a shadow of genuine fear crossed Robert Garrison's face. David Morrison was a legend in the private aviation industry. Brilliant, demanding, and utterly ruthless in his protection of his company and his clients. A direct call from him to a pilot on the tarmac was unheard of. It was unprecedented. It was the aviation equivalent of God calling a foot soldier on the battlefield. Garrison's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the phone. It felt unnaturally heavy in his palm, like a block of lead, like a death sentence. He held it to his ear, his voice suddenly hoarse, all the confidence and authority stripped away. This is Captain Garrison. He didn't get to say another word. David Morrison's voice erupted from the phone, loud enough for both Chloe and Leo to hear every syllable, loud enough to echo through the cabin, loud enough to strip away any remaining shred of Garrison's dignity. Garrison, what in God's name do you think you are doing? Have you lost your mind? Are you clinically insane? Garrison flinched as if he had been physically struck. The woman you are trying to throw off that aircraft is Dr. Vivian Ashford. She is not just a client, Garrison. She is our most important client. Her company's contract is worth more than your entire career, you arrogant fool. The cabin of the Gulfstream G650 had become a courtroom, and Robert Garrison was on trial. He stood in the center of the aisle, phone pressed to his ear, his face cycling through colors like a broken traffic light. Red with humiliation, white with fear, gray with the dawning realization that he had made a catastrophic mistake. His free hand hung at his side, opening and closing reflexively, grasping for something solid in a world that was suddenly shifting beneath his feet. David Morrison's voice continued to pour through the phone, a torrent of cold fury that filled the cabin. Do you have any idea what you've done? Any concept of the damage you've caused in the past 5 minutes? I built this company from nothing. From a single leased aircraft and a prayer. I spent 20 years cultivating relationships, building trust, establishing a reputation for excellence. And you, in your infinite wisdom, have decided to jeopardize all of it because of what? Because Dr. Ashford doesn't fit your profile. Garrison opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to explain. Mr. Morrison, if I could just... You could not, Morrison cut him off, his voice like a blade. You could not just anything. You do not get to speak. You do not get to explain. You do not get to offer your theories about profiles and what wealthy people are supposed to look like. In his Manhattan office, David Morrison had risen from his chair. He was pacing now, his free hand pressed against his forehead, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The executives around him had gone silent, watching their CEO with expressions of barely concealed alarm. "Do you know who Dr. Vivian Ashford is, Garrison? Do you have any idea? She's not some influencer or someone's arm candy. She's the founder and CEO of Nexus Dynamics. She's a genius whose work is going to change the face of medicine. The deal she closed in Aspen this week, it positions her company to potentially cure hereditary blindness. She's saving people's sight. Garrison, she's changing lives. And you tried to have her thrown off a plane like a common trespasser." Garrison's face had gone ashen. The blood had drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking 10 years older than he had just minutes before. I didn't know," he managed to stammer. "There was no way to... No way to what? No way to treat a passenger with basic human decency, no way to verify her identity before accusing her of fraud, no way to exercise a shred of professional judgment instead of defaulting to your ugly assumptions." Morrison's voice dropped, becoming quieter, but somehow more dangerous. "Let me paint you a picture, Bob, since you seem to have trouble seeing things clearly." He paused, and in that pause Garrison could hear the rustle of papers, the click of a keyboard. "I'm looking at Dr. Ashford's account right now. She has a 5-year exclusive lease on that aircraft. That contract is worth approximately $20 million to this company. $20 million. She has personally referred 3 other clients to Apex over the past 2 years. Clients who have collectively spent another $8 million on charter services. She has a perfect payment record. She has never complained about a single flight, a single meal, a single crew member. She is by every metric we have the perfect client." Another pause. Garrison could hear his own heartbeat in the silence. "And you just threatened to have her arrested." Chloe and Leo stood frozen near the galley, watching the scene unfold with expressions of horrified fascination. They could hear every word, every syllable of Garrison's destruction. The cabin that had felt so spacious just minutes before now felt claustrophobic, the walls closing in on a man whose world was collapsing in real time. "I'm going to give you a set of instructions now," Morrison continued, his voice cold and precise. "And you are going to follow them to the letter. You are going to hand the phone back to Dr. Ashford. You are going to apologize to her profusely, and you are going to mean it. And then you are going to do whatever she tells you to do. Is that understood?" Garrison swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed visibly. "Yes, sir." The words came out as a croak, barely audible, stripped of all the authority and confidence that had characterized his voice just minutes before. "Your career is hanging by a single thread," Garrison Morrison said, delivering the final blow. "And that thread is in Dr. Ashford's hand. You'd better pray she doesn't decide to cut it. Now give her back the phone." The line went dead. Garrison stood there for a long moment, the silent phone in his hand. The device that had just delivered his professional death sentence. The small rectangle of glass and metal that had transformed him from the pilot in command to a man awaiting judgment. The silence in the cabin was now one of pure, unadulterated humiliation. Chloe had pressed herself against the galley counter, her eyes wide, her face pale. Leo stood rigid, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed a complex mixture of emotions, vindication, sympathy, and something that looked almost like respect for what Dr. Ashford had just done. Slowly, his arms stiff and robotic, Garrison handed the phone back to Vivian. His eyes met hers, and she saw everything in them. The arrogance was gone. The contempt was gone. The certainty that he had been right, that he had been justified, that his profile had been accurate. All of it had been stripped away. What remained was fear. Desperate, pleading, naked fear. He had made a catastrophic mistake. A career-ending mistake. And he had made it with the one person in the world who held all the cards. Vivian took the phone back, her expression unreadable. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look smug. She didn't show any of the vindictive pleasure that a lesser person might have displayed in this moment. Instead, she looked tired, weary, as if the entire episode had drained something vital from her. She glanced at the phone screen, confirmed that the call had ended, and placed it beside her on the cream leather seat. When she looked back up at Garrison, her face was still neutral, still composed. But her eyes had changed. There was steel in them now. Cold, hard steel. Dr. Ashford Garrison began, his voice a hoarse croak, all the confidence and authority stripped away, replaced by the desperate tremor of a man who knew he was on the edge of an abyss. I apologize. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. Vivian looked at him. Just looked. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. A misunderstanding, Captain? She asked, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of a judge's gavel. Is that what you're calling this? Garrison's mouth opened and closed. No words came out, because it seemed quite clear to me. Vivian continued, each word precise, measured landing with surgical accuracy. You made a series of decisions based on my age, my gender, and my race. You looked at me and decided that I couldn't possibly be the person in charge. You decided that I must be someone's mistress, someone's kept woman, an influencer on a joyride. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving his. You were prepared to have me physically removed from this aircraft, to have me humiliated in front of security personnel and airport staff, to have me treated like a criminal, like a trespasser, like someone who had no right to be here. Her voice dropped, becoming quieter, but somehow more devastating. And now you want to call it a misunderstanding. Garrison's face crumpled. The last remnants of his composure shattered. I was wrong, he said, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. I made a mistake, a grave error in judgment. I should have verified. I should have listened. I should have... Yes, Vivian interrupted, her voice still calm, still controlled. You should have. But you didn't. Because you took one look at me and decided you already knew everything you needed to know. She paused, letting her words sink in. That's not a misunderstanding, Captain. That's a conclusion. One you reached before I said a single word. Leo and Chloe remained by the door, frozen in place, witnesses to a complete professional demolition. Leo felt a strange mix of emotions churning in his chest. Horror for Garrison, yes, but also a profound, almost reverential respect for Dr. Ashford. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't demanding. She wasn't losing control or indulging in petty revenge. She was simply holding up a mirror, and the reflection was devastating. In the rear of the cabin, Elena Vega's phone had captured everything. The video was still recording now, running past the 10-minute mark. Her post on social media had already gained traction, thousands of views in just a few minutes, comments flooding in, retweets multiplying exponentially. The story was spreading. The internet was watching. And Robert Garrison had no idea. He stood before Vivian, broken and desperate, his 35-year career crumbling around him like a sandcastle in a rising tide. Please, he said, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. Please, Dr. Ashford. I have a family. I have a wife. I've been flying for 35 years. This is all I know. Don't let one mistake, one terrible, unforgivable mistake, end my career. Vivian looked at him. She saw the desperation in his eyes. She saw the fear, the regret, the dawning understanding of what he had done and what it was going to cost him. She saw a man who in the space of 5 minutes had destroyed everything he had spent decades building. Part of her felt something that might have been pity. a distant clinical recognition that this man was suffering, that his suffering was real, that the consequences he was about to face would be severe and lasting. But she also saw the man who just 5 minutes earlier had been prepared to ruin her day, who had been prepared to have her publicly humiliated at a busy airport, who had looked at her with contempt and derision, who had spoken to her as if she were less than human, who had dismissed her as nothing more than arm candy or a scammer who had wandered onto the wrong aircraft. And she knew that compassion in this moment would be misplaced. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about one confrontation on one aircraft on one sunny afternoon in Aspen. It was about every other person who didn't fit Captain Robert Garrison's profile. Every black executive who might board this plane in the future. Every woman in comfortable clothes who might be mistaken for the help. Every person who might be judged, dismissed, and humiliated because they didn't look the way wealth was supposed to look. Enabling prejudice was not compassion. It was complicity. Vivian looked past Garrison, her eyes meeting Leo's for a moment, then Chloe's. "Chloe," she said, her voice calm and decisive, brooking no argument. "Please secure the cabin door. We will not be departing just yet." "Yes, Sir Ashford," Chloe said, moving with visible relief at having something concrete to do, something that would take her away from the unbearable tension at the center of the cabin. "First Officer Martinez." Leo straightened his expression attentive. "Yes, please contact the FBU. Inform them that we require a new captain for our flight to Teterboro." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle over the cabin. "Effective immediately." The order was a clean, precise cut. 4 words that ended a career. A life's work. A 35-year journey from the first day of flight school to the command seat of a Gulfstream G650. Effective immediately. Captain Robert Garrison physically recoiled from the words. His body jerked backward as if he had been struck, staggering back a full step, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the mahogany trim of the cabin wall. His face contorted through a rapid succession of emotions, disbelief, horror, desperation, and finally a terrible, bottomless despair. "No," he breathed the word escaping his lips like a prayer. "No, please, please, Dr. Ashford, you can't. I can." Vivian interrupted, her voice still calm, still controlled, still carrying the quiet authority of someone who had made her decision and would not be moved from it. "And I am." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked on his. "Let me be very clear about something, Captain, since there seems to be some confusion about the nature of our relationship." Garrison's eyes widened. A tiny flicker of hope appeared in their depths. Perhaps she was going to explain something. Perhaps there was still a way out of this nightmare. Perhaps he could still salvage something, anything from the wreckage of his career. This jet, Vivian began gesturing with one hand at the cream leather seats, the polished mahogany, the brushed steel accents that surrounded them. "This $70 million machine that you are so proud to command." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I don't own it." The hope in Garrison's eyes brightened. A technicality. A way out. She didn't own the aircraft. Perhaps this meant something. Perhaps this changed the equation somehow. Vivian saw the hope. And with her next words, she extinguished it. "I don't own the aircraft. I own the lease." She held his gaze, her eyes steady, her voice unwavering. "For the next 5 years, this Gulfstream G650 tail number N4227A is for all intents and purposes mine. I have exclusive rights to its use. I decide when it flies, where it flies, and who flies it. Apex Aviation. The company that signs your paycheck manages the aircraft on my behalf. They maintain it, they fuel it, they staff it with crews." She leaned back slightly, but her eyes never left his. "Which means, Captain, that while you may technically hold the title of pilot in command, The reality is quite different." Her voice dropped, becoming quieter, but somehow more devastating. "You are flying my plane, and you just tried to kick me off of it." The words landed like hammer blows. Garrison's face had gone grey. The color had drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking not just older, but somehow diminished, shrunken. The man who had filled the cabin with his authority and his certainty just minutes before now looked small, insignificant, defeated. Every pretense, every justification, every rationalization he might have clung to was stripped away in that moment. He wasn't the guardian of a valuable asset, protecting it from an intruder. He wasn't the wise veteran using his experience to identify a threat. He wasn't the pilot in command exercising his authority to ensure safety and security. He was a glorified chauffeur who had just insulted his boss. "The problem isn't that you didn't know who I was." Vivian continued delivering the line that would haunt Garrison for the rest of his life. "The problem is how you treated someone you thought didn't matter." She let those words hang in the air between them. "You didn't ask for verification. You didn't check with dispatch. You didn't even give me the basic courtesy of examining my identification. You took one look at me, at my skin, at my clothes, at my age, and you decided that I couldn't possibly be the person in charge. You decided that I must be a fraud, a gold digger, someone's mistress who had wandered onto the wrong aircraft." Her voice hardened. "And then you threatened to have me arrested." Garrison's mouth moved, but no sound came out. His lips formed words. Perhaps another apology. Perhaps another plea. But his voice had failed him. He stood there in the aisle of the aircraft, a broken man in a captain's uniform, watching his world collapse around him. "I've been in rooms full of people who assumed I was the assistant," Vivian said, her voice taking on a quality of weary resignation. "I've been in meetings where men addressed their questions to my male colleagues because they couldn't conceive that the woman at the table might be the one making the decisions. I've been patronized, dismissed, underestimated, and overlooked more times than I can count." She shook her head slowly. "But I have never in all my years had someone look at me with such contempt and try to have me physically removed from a space I had every right to occupy." "That's a new one, Captain." "Congratulations." Chloe had returned from securing the cabin door. She stood near the forward galley, her face pale, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The injustice of what she had witnessed, the raw ugliness of Garrison's assumptions and behavior, had shaken her more than she would have thought possible. Leo remained by the cockpit door, his expression carefully neutral. But his mind was racing. He was thinking about all the times he had seen Garrison be dismissive, condescending, or outright rude to people he considered beneath him. He was thinking about the complaints he had heard whispered in crew lounges and break rooms. Complaints that were always attributed to Garrison's old-school style, but that were really about something uglier. He was thinking about how many times he had stayed silent, and he was thinking about how he would never stay silent again. Garrison made one last, desperate attempt. "Dr. Ashford," he said, his voice cracking, his hands coming together in an unconscious gesture of supplication. "Please, I have a family, a wife who depends on me, a mortgage, a life that I've built over 35 years. I know I made a terrible mistake. I know I was wrong. But please don't let one moment of poor judgment destroy everything I've worked for." Vivian considered his words. She considered the man standing before her, his pride stripped away, his career in ruins, his future suddenly and terrifyingly uncertain. She considered the wife he had mentioned, the mortgage, the life he had built. She considered the very real human cost of the decision she was about to make. And then she considered the alternative. She considered what it would mean to let him off the hook, to accept his apology, to chalk it up to a misunderstanding, to allow him to continue flying as if nothing had happened. She considered the message that would send to him, to other pilots, to everyone who might be inclined to make the same assumptions he had made. She considered all the people who would never have the power she had, all the people who would be subjected to this same treatment and would have no recourse, no CEO to call, no leverage to use, all the people who would simply have to swallow the insult and deplane quietly their dignity, stolen, their humanity denied. And she made her decision. Captain Garrison. She said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a sentence. Your services are no longer required on this flight, or on any of my future flights. She picked up her folder of scientific papers, the research summaries from the Meridian acquisition that she had planned to review on the flight home. I suggest you collect your belongings and exit the aircraft. She opened the folder, her eyes dropping to the first page. The aircraft, she added without looking up, that you were so eager for me to leave. The gesture was unmistakable. The conversation was over. He was dismissed. Robert Garrison stood there for a full 30 seconds, frozen in place, unable to move. The cabin around him seemed to blur at the edges, becoming surreal, dreamlike. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. In the space of less than 15 minutes, he had gone from the pilot in command of a $70 million aircraft to a man who had just been fired by a passenger. He looked at Chloe, hoping to find some sympathy, some support, some acknowledgement that this was all a terrible mistake. But Chloe wouldn't meet his eyes. She stared at the floor, her face pale, her body language closed off. He looked at Leo, his first officer, the man who was supposed to support him, to back him up, to have his back. But Leo's expression was carefully blank neutral, giving nothing away. There was no sympathy there, no support, just the cool, professional detachment of a subordinate who was already calculating his own next moves. Garrison was alone, completely, utterly alone. Without another word, his shoulders slumped in defeat, he turned and walked toward the cockpit. His steps were heavy, mechanical, the steps of a man moving through a nightmare from which he could not wake. He retrieved his flight bag from behind the captain's seat. He picked up his jacket from where he had hung it. He gathered the personal effects that marked this cockpit as his domain. Then he walked back through the cabin, his gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet the eyes of anyone he passed. As he reached the open door, he paused for a fraction of a second. His body half turned as if he might look back, might make one final appeal, might find some last shred of hope to cling to. But one glance at Dr. Ashford, engrossed in her papers, told him everything he needed to know. It was over. He descended the stairs, not as a respected captain, not as a decorated pilot with 35 years of experience, but as a man who had been summarily fired. He stepped onto the sunlit tarmac, the mountain air that had seemed so crisp and invigorating just hours before, now feeling thin and cold in his lungs. Behind him, the door of the Gulfstream G650 closed with a soft, final thud. It was the sound of a world ending. It was the sound of consequences arriving. It was the sound of a man learning far too late that the rules he had lived by no longer applied. The Aspen-Pitkin County Airport tarmac was a study in contrasts. On one side, sleek private jets gleamed in the afternoon sun, their polished surfaces reflecting the surrounding mountain peaks like mirrors. Ground crew members in pristine uniforms moved efficiently between aircraft, their movements choreographed by years of practice. Everything was clean, orderly, precise. On the other side, walking away from the Gulfstream G650 that had been his command just minutes before, was Robert Garrison. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the space of 15 minutes. His steps were uncertain, shuffling, lacking the confident stride that had characterized his movement through airports and terminals for more than 3 decades. His flight bag, which usually hung from his shoulder with the ease of long familiarity, now seemed to weigh him down, dragging at him like an anchor. He couldn't just leave the airport. Protocol demanded that he officially hand off his duties, that he complete the paperwork that accompanied any change in crew, that he brief his replacement on the aircraft's status and the flight plan. These were the mundane administrative tasks that he had performed hundreds of times throughout his career, tasks so routine that they had become automatic. Now they felt like torture. The FBP, the fixed base operator that served as the hub for private aviation at Aspen, was housed in a modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the tarmac. As Garrison approached the entrance, he saw faces turning toward him. Pilots he had known for years. Ground crew members who had greeted him with respect countless times. Dispatchers and operations personnel who had coordinated his flights across continents. They were all looking at him, and they were all whispering. The gossip had already begun to spread through the tight-knit aviation community like wildfire through dry brush. Someone from the FBO must have overheard the radio traffic. Someone must have seen him walking away from the aircraft. Someone must have put two and two together and started sharing the news. "Did you hear Garrison got kicked off his own flight?" The passenger fired him. Right there on the tarmac. What did he do? What could possibly have happened? Garrison felt the weight of their stares as he pushed through the glass doors and entered the operations center. The conversations didn't stop, not entirely, but they dropped to whispers, to murmurs, to sidelong glances that followed him across the room. He approached the operations desk where a young dispatcher named Tyler was studiously avoiding his gaze. "I need to hand off to my replacement." Garrison said, his voice hoarse. "Captain Rodriguez. She's being brought in to take over the flight." Tyler nodded, still not meeting his eyes. "Yes, sir. She's en route. Should be here in about 45 minutes. There's a briefing room you can use to wait, and—" "I'll wait here," Garrison interrupted. He didn't want to hide in a briefing room. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing him slink away. He would stand here in the operations center and face whatever came next. It was the only shred of dignity he had left. He found a seat in the pilot's lounge, a comfortable leather chair positioned near the window with a view of the tarmac. He sat down heavily, his flight bag at his feet, and stared out at the aircraft he had just lost. The Gulfstream GC-650 sat there in the afternoon sun, gleaming beautiful, utterly indifferent to the human drama that had just unfolded inside its cabin. It was just an aircraft, just metal and carbon fiber and avionics and jet fuel. It didn't know or care that a 35-year career had just ended within its walls. But Garrison cared. He cared deeply. He replayed the confrontation in his mind over and over, an endless loop of humiliation and regret. He heard his own voice dripping with condescension, asking if she was with the catering service. He heard himself saying she didn't fit the profile. He heard himself threatening to have her removed by security. And he heard David Morrison's voice, cold and furious, delivering the verdict. "Your career is hanging by a single thread, and that thread is in Dr. Ashford's hand." How had he been so wrong? The woman's quiet confidence, her simple clothes, her lack of obvious wealth markers, it had all registered in his mind as red flags. Warning signs. Indicators that something was off, that she didn't belong, that she must be some kind of imposter or stowaway or gold digger who had stumbled onto the wrong aircraft. He realized now, with the clarity of hindsight, that he had been seeing exactly what he expected to see. His 35 years of experience, his thousands of hours in the cockpit, his interactions with the wealthy and powerful, all of it had created a template in his mind. A profile. And anyone who didn't fit that profile was automatically suspect. But the profile had been wrong. The profile had always been wrong. The profile was just a convenient framework for his own prejudices dressed up in the language of experience and expertise. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text message from Apex Dispatch. "Do not leave Aspen. Await instructions from Mr. Morrison's office. Hotel room will be booked for you." He was stranded. A pilot without a plane. A captain without a command. a man who had spent his entire adult life in motion crisscrossing the globe at 500 miles per hour, now grounded in a mountain resort town with nowhere to go and nothing to do but wait. 45 minutes later, Captain Eva Rodriguez arrived. She came through the doors of the FBO with the energy and confidence of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. Early 40s, with sharp features and intelligent dark eyes, she moved with the efficient grace of a pilot who had logged thousands of hours in cockpits around the world. She was the physical embodiment of everything Garrison was not. Young, female, Hispanic, confident without being arrogant, professional without being rigid. A pilot who had risen through the ranks on merit alone, who had proven herself again and again in an industry that was still, despite progress, dominated by men who looked like Robert Garrison. She spotted him immediately and walked over, her expression professional but cool. "Captain Garrison," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of an accent that spoke of a childhood spent between Miami and San Juan. "I'm Eva Rodriguez. I understand I'm taking over the flight to Teterboro." Garrison could only nod. The humiliation burned in his chest like acid. He was being replaced by a woman, a younger woman, a woman who in his worldview should have been his subordinate, should have been deferring to his experience, should have been grateful for any opportunity to learn from his expertise. Instead, she was taking his command. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. "The aircraft is fueled and ready," he managed to say, forcing the words out through a throat that felt like it was filled with sand. "Flight plan is filed. Weight and balance is calculated. The passenger is in the cabin." Rodriguez nodded, her face impassive. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't inquire about the circumstances that had led to this handover. She simply accepted the information, processed it, and moved on. "Thank you, Captain," she said. "I have it from here." There was no sympathy in her voice, no questions, no attempt to understand or commiserate. Just a clean, professional severance. Garrison's official duties were concluded. He watched through the lounge window as Rodriguez walked across the tarmac toward the Gulf Stream. He watched her climb the stairs with easy confidence. He watched the door close behind her. And then, 90 minutes after he had first walked through that same door, convinced of his own authority and certain of his own judgment, he watched the aircraft begin to move. The Gulfstream GC-650 taxied slowly toward the runway, its twin Rolls-Royce engines humming with restrained power. It paused at the threshold, conducting the final checks that Garrison himself had performed hundreds of times. The engines spooled up the sound building to a roar that carried across the tarmac even through the FBO's thick windows. Then, with a graceful roaring surge of power, the aircraft launched itself into the crisp mountain air. It climbed steeply, banking eastward toward New York, a silver dart disappearing into the vast blue canvas of the Colorado sky. Garrison watched until the aircraft was nothing more than a glint of light against the mountains. It was his jet. It was his flight. And it was leaving without him. Carrying the woman he had insulted, the woman he had dismissed, the woman he had tried to have arrested. Carrying her toward the life he had coveted, toward the success he had envied, toward a future that would continue to unfold in ways he could never have imagined. While he remained here, grounded, alone, in the ruins of his own making. The moment the Gulfstream's door closed behind Captain Garrison, a profound silence settled over the cabin. It was a different kind of silence than before. Not the crackling tension of confrontation, not the heavy weight of accusation and defense. This was something else, something emptier. The quiet aftermath of a storm that had passed, leaving debris in its wake. Leo Martinez stood near the cockpit door, his posture rigid, his mind racing. He had just witnessed something that would stay with him for the rest of his career. A defining moment. A line in the sand. The kind of experience that divided time into before and after. Chloe Bennet had retreated to the galley, her hands moving automatically through the motions of straightening already straight items, arranging already arranged glasses. It was busy work, the kind of activity that gave her something to do with her hands, while her mind processed what she had just seen. Dr. Vivian Ashford sat in her seat, the folder of research papers still open on her lap, but her eyes were unfocused. She wasn't reading. She was staring at the pages without seeing them, her thoughts clearly somewhere else entirely. The source of the conflict was gone, but his ghost lingered. For a full minute no one spoke. The only sounds were the soft hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit and the distant murmur of activity on the tarmac outside. Finally, Vivian closed the folder. She set it aside, took a deep breath, and looked up at her remaining crew members. Leo. Chloe. Her voice was different now. The steel was still there, but tempered with something softer, wearier, more human. Please, come have a seat for a moment. They exchanged a nervous glance, the kind of look that passed between subordinates who weren't sure if they were about to be praised or punished. Then, hesitantly, they moved toward the cream leather chairs opposite Vivian's seat and perched on the edges, their posture conveying their uncertainty. Vivian studied them for a moment, seeing their fear, their confusion, their desperate hope that they hadn't somehow been tainted by Garrison's behavior. "I want to be very clear about something," she began, her voice even and calm. "What happened in this cabin had nothing to do with either of you. Your conduct was professional appropriate, and I appreciate it." She saw some of the tension drain from Chloe's shoulders, saw Leo's jaw unclench slightly. "Leo, you attempted to intervene. You tried to redirect Captain Garrison. You reminded him of the proper protocols. I recognize that, and I thank you for it." Leo swallowed hard. His eyes glistened with something that might have been relief, or might have been something deeper. "He shouldn't have spoken to you that way," Leo said, his voice rough with emotion. There was no excuse for it. None. I've seen him be difficult before, but this was something else entirely. "Yes," Vivian agreed quietly. "It was. I should have done more." Leo continued the words, tumbling out as if he had been holding them back. "I should have stepped in more forcefully. I should have—" "You did what you could," Vivian interrupted gently. "You were in an impossible position. He was your superior. He was the pilot in command. Challenging him more directly would have put your own career at risk." "I understand that." She leaned forward slightly. "But I want you to know something, Leo. I will be speaking with David Morrison later today. I will make sure he knows that you and Chloe handled a difficult situation with professionalism and integrity. Your records with Apex will not be negatively affected by what happened here." She paused, letting the words sink in. "In fact, I will ensure the opposite." Chloe let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you, Dr. Ashford," she said, her voice catching slightly. That's very generous of you." "It's not generous," Vivian corrected gently. "It's fair. There's a difference." She sat back, her gaze moving between them. "What Captain Garrison did today was wrong. It was prejudiced, it was unprofessional, and it was a violation of every standard of human decency. But the two of you are not responsible for his actions. You didn't share his views. You didn't support his behavior. You were bystanders caught in a situation that you didn't create and couldn't control." Leo nodded slowly, processing her words. Now Vivian continued, her tone shifting to something more businesslike. "Let's address the practical matters. Leo, have you contacted the FBO about a replacement pilot?" "Yes, Dr. Ashford. I spoke with dispatch. They're coordinating with Apex. Captain Eva Rodriguez is on standby nearby and is being brought over. They estimate about 90 minutes before we can depart." "Excellent. Vivian nodded with approval. Chloe, once the new captain arrives and we're cleared for takeoff, please proceed with the meal service as planned. I'll have the chamomile tea you mentioned earlier. Of course, Dr. Ashford. And for yourselves, Vivian added, her expression softening as she looked at their still tense faces. Please help yourselves to whatever you'd like. I imagine this has been a stressful afternoon for everyone. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. An acknowledgement that they were human beings who had just been through an ordeal, not just employees fulfilling a function. Chloe's eyes glistened with grateful tears. Leo's rigid posture finally relaxed. Thank you, Chloe said quietly, for understanding, for not blaming us. Vivian gave her a small, tired smile. The only person responsible for Captain Garrison's behavior is Captain Garrison. I learned a long time ago that blaming people for things they didn't do is just another form of the same prejudice that got us here in the first place. She dismissed them with a gentle nod, and they retreated to their respective areas, the tension in their shoulders easing considerably. As they moved away, Vivian heard Chloe whisper something to Leo, and Leo's quiet response words of mutual reassurance and support. Vivian turned back to the window, looking out at the mountain peaks that surrounded the airport. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent, painting the snow-capped summits in shades of gold and rose. She had done what needed to be done. She had stood her ground. She had refused to be diminished, dismissed, or denied. She had used her power not for revenge, but for accountability. And yet, sitting there in the quiet cabin, she felt no triumph, no vindication, no surge of victory. She felt tired. She felt sad. She felt the weight of all the battles she had fought, all the assumptions she had challenged, all the prejudices she had confronted over the course of her 34 years. Would there ever be a time when she could simply exist? When she could walk into a room, onto a plane, into a meeting without being measured, judged, categorized, and found wanting? When her accomplishments would speak for themselves without the constant need to prove that she belonged? She didn't know. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would keep fighting. She would keep standing. She would keep refusing to be lesser than she was, to accept less than she deserved, to tolerate less than basic human dignity. Not just for herself, for everyone who would come after her. Captain Eva Rodriguez entered the cabin of the Gulfstream G650 like a breath of fresh air. She moved with the confident efficiency of a pilot who had logged thousands of hours at the controls of aircraft, ranging from single-engine Cessnas to wide-body commercial jets. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture perfect, her dark eyes taking in every detail of the cabin with practiced assessment. Dr. Ashford, she said, approaching Vivian's seat with a professional smile. I'm Captain Eva Rodriguez. I'll be taking you to Teterboro this afternoon. Vivian looked up from her papers and felt something in her chest loosen. The contrast with Garrison was so stark, so immediate, that it was almost disorienting. Where Garrison had radiated suspicion and hostility, Rodriguez projected calm competence. Where Garrison had looked at her with judgment, Rodriguez looked at her with simple, uncomplicated respect. Captain Rodriguez, Vivian said, rising slightly to shake the pilot's hand. Thank you for stepping in on short notice. Happy to help. Rodriguez's handshake was firm and brief. I've reviewed the flight plan. Weather looks good. We should have a smooth ride all the way to New Jersey. Unless there's anything specific you need, I'll get started on the pre-flight checks. That sounds perfect. Rodriguez nodded and turned toward the cockpit, pausing only to exchange a few words with Leo, who had remained in the cabin to assist with the transition. Their interaction was easy, professional, two colleagues who understood and respected each other's roles. Vivian watched them, feeling something that might have been hope beginning to stir in her chest. This was how it was supposed to be. This was what professional service looked like. No assumptions, no judgments, no profiles that determined who belonged and who didn't. Just competence, respect, and the simple acknowledgement of each person's humanity. 20 minutes later, the pre-flight checks were complete. The cabin door was secured. The engines began their soft building whine as the aircraft prepared to move. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the cabin intercom, calm and confident. "Dr. Ashford, this is Captain Rodriguez. We've been cleared for departure. Our flight time to Teterboro will be approximately 3 hours and 45 minutes. The weather en route looks excellent, and we should have you on the ground in New Jersey right on schedule. Please sit back, relax, and let us take care of you." The message was routine, the kind of announcement that pilots made thousands of times every day on aircraft around the world. But to Vivian, sitting in her cream leather seat, it carried a weight that went far beyond the simple conveyance of information. Let us take care of you. Such simple words. Such a profound promise. The aircraft began to taxi, moving smoothly across the tarmac toward the runway. Through the window, Vivian could see the FBO building sliding past its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the afternoon sun. She wondered if Garrison was still in there, watching, waiting, contemplating the wreckage of his career. She felt no satisfaction at the thought, only a quiet, resigned sadness. The Gulfstream reached the runway threshold and paused, the engines holding at idle while the pilots completed their final checks. Vivian heard the soft click of seatbelt signs being activated, felt the subtle shift in the aircraft's systems as everything aligned for takeoff. Then the engines spooled up. The sound built from a whisper to a hum, to a roar, a crescendo of power that pressed Vivian back into her seat. The aircraft began to move slowly at first, then faster, accelerating down the runway with a smooth, inexorable power. And then they were airborne. The wheels left the ground, and the world outside the window began to tilt and shift. The tarmac fell away. The terminal buildings shrank to toy size. The runway became a grey ribbon stretching across the valley floor. The aircraft climbed steeply, banking eastward, and suddenly the mountains were below them, their snow-capped peaks glittering in the afternoon sun, like diamonds scattered across green velvet. The sky opened up above, vast and blue and infinite. Vivian felt the tension of the past 90 minutes begin to drain from her shoulders. The cabin was quiet now, peaceful, filled only with the soft hum of the engines and the gentle whisper of air flowing over the wings. Chloe appeared at her elbow with a steaming cup of chamomile tea, the fragrance gentle and soothing. "Your tea, Dr. Ashford," she said, her voice warm but professional, back to the standard of service that Vivian had come to expect and appreciate. "Thank you, Chloe." Vivian took the cup, wrapping her hands around its warmth, and turned back to the window. Below, the Rocky Mountains spread out in all their magnificent glory. Range after range of peaks and valleys and forests and streams. Soon they would give way to the Great Plains, then the Midwest, then the rolling hills of the eastern seaboard, and at the end of the journey home. She would sleep in her own bed tonight. She would wake up tomorrow and return to the work that mattered, the research, the science, the pursuit of cures that could change millions of lives. She would put this incident behind her and move forward as she always did, as she always had. But something had shifted. Something had changed. She had stood her ground today. She had refused to be diminished. She had used her power not for personal revenge, but for something larger, for accountability for the principle that dignity was not contingent on fitting someone's profile. And in doing so, she had set something in motion. She didn't know it yet, but the ripples of what had happened in that cabin would spread far beyond the mountains of Colorado. They would reach boardrooms and courtrooms, break rooms and meeting rooms. They would change policies and procedures, careers and lives. Captain Robert Garrison was about to discover just how far those ripples would reach, and just how deeply they would cut. The global headquarters of Apex Aviation occupied the top 10 floors of a glass and steel skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. From the street, it was just another tower in a forest of towers, its reflective surface mirroring the clouds and the surrounding buildings anonymous and imposing. But inside it was a testament to power success and the particular kind of ambition that builds empires from nothing. Robert Garrison had been to this building before. He had come here for commendations for seniority meetings, for the kinds of professional gatherings that marked the milestones of a successful career. He had walked through the marble lobby with his head high, had ridden the elevator to the executive floors with the easy confidence of a man who belonged. Today was different. Today he felt like a condemned man walking to the gallows. The elevator ride to the 50th floor seemed to take an eternity. The car was empty except for Garrison, the other occupants having exited at lower floors, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his dread. The soft classical music that played through the speakers felt mocking inappropriately serene for the circumstances. The doors opened onto an expanse of hushed elegance. Thick carpeting absorbed his footsteps. Original artwork lined the walls and soles. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Central Park, a sweeping vista of green and gold in the early autumn light. A young woman at the reception desk looked up as he approached. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Garrison thought he detected something behind her eyes. Knowledge. Judgment. The awareness that the man standing before her was about to have a very bad day. "Captain Garrison," she said, "Mr. Morrison is expecting you. Please follow me." She led him down a corridor lined with more artwork, past conference rooms, with frosted glass walls past the offices of vice presidents and directors and other executives who ran the vast machinery of Apex Aviation. At the end of the corridor was a set of double doors, solid mahogany with brushed steel handles. The woman opened the doors and stepped aside. "Mr. Morrison will see you now." Garrison walked through the doors into David Morrison's personal office. The room was vast and minimalist, designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. A single massive oak desk dominated the space, positioned to give its occupant a commanding view of Central Park through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind it. The walls were lined with photographs, Morrison shaking hands with presidents and prime ministers standing next to aircraft that bore the Apex Aviation livery, accepting awards and accolades from industry associations. A single piece of paper lay on the desk. Even from across the room, Garrison could see the Apex Aviation letterhead at the top. David Morrison was standing by the window, his back to the door. He wasn't a large man, perhaps 5'10", with the lean build of someone who maintained his fitness through discipline rather than vanity. But he radiated an intensity that filled the room, that seemed to make the air itself thicker and harder to breathe. He didn't turn around when Garrison entered. He simply stood there, silhouetted against the bright light from the windows looking out at the park below. "Sit." The word was not a request. Garrison sat in one of the two leather chairs facing the desk. The chair was expensive, well-crafted, designed for comfort. But at that moment it felt like an electric chair. The silence stretched. Garrison could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the sweat beginning to dampen his collar. He wanted to speak, to say something, to fill the terrible void with words. But something told him to wait. Something told him that anything he said would only make things worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David Morrison turned around. His face was calm, completely, utterly calm. The kind of calm that a surgeon might display before a difficult amputation. The kind of calm that came from having already made all the necessary decisions, from having already determined the outcome. It was far more terrifying than if he had been yelling. Robert Morrison began walking slowly toward the desk, but choosing to stand beside it rather than sit. The position allowed him to tower over Garrison, to look down at him like a judge addressing a defendant. 35 years of flight time. An impeccable safety record. Not a single incident, not a single accident, not a single mark against your name in more than 3 decades of flying. You were one of my best, Bob. One of my most trusted senior captains. I would have trusted you with my own family." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And in 5 minutes, you destroyed all of it." Garrison opened his mouth to speak, but Morrison continued without pause. "Do you have any idea, any concept of the damage you have caused? Not just to yourself, not just to your career, but to this company, to the reputation I have spent 20 years building." Mr. Morrison Garrison managed his voice hoarse. "If I could just explain what." Morrison's voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Explain that you're a prejudiced fool who let his personal biases override his professional judgment. Explain that you verbally assaulted, threatened, and attempted to have arrested our single most valuable client. There is nothing to explain, Captain. Nothing." He moved behind the desk and picked up a tablet, swiping through screens with sharp, angry movements. "I have the cockpit voice recorder transcripts. I have statements from First Officer Martinez and Flight Attendant Bennett. I have video footage that has been viewed over 12 million times on social media. Most importantly, I had a 2-hour phone call with a very, very angry Dr. Vivian Ashford." He set the tablet down and fixed Garrison with a stare that could have frozen water. "Let me paint you a picture, Bob, since you seem to have trouble seeing clearly." He walked around the desk, positioning himself directly in front of Garrison, close enough that the seated man had to look up to meet his eyes. "Dr. Vivian Ashford is the founder and CEO of Nexus Dynamics. Her company is on the bleeding edge of gene therapy research. The deal she closed in Aspen, the deal she was flying home from when you decided to throw her off the plane, positions her company to potentially cure 2 different types of hereditary blindness within the next decade." Morrison's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. "She's not an influencer, Bob. She's not someone's sugar daddy's plaything. She's a genius who is changing the face of medicine. She's saving people's sight. She's changing lives. And you looked at her and saw a problem to be removed." Garrison felt the blood drain from his face. He had known that Dr. Ashford was important. He had known from the moment David Morrison's voice had exploded from that phone that he had made a catastrophic mistake. But hearing it laid out like this, hearing the magnitude of who she was and what she represented, made it somehow worse. "We have a 5-year exclusive contract with her for that aircraft." Morrison continued, his voice hard and flat. "A contract valued at approximately $20 million. She has personally referred 3 other clients to Apex over the past 2 years, clients who have collectively spent another $8 million on charter services. She has a perfect payment history. She has never complained about a single flight, a single meal, a single crew member in all the time she has been with us." He leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk. "And you threatened to have her arrested." Garrison's mouth was dry. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "After your little stunt, Morrison continued, her legal team contacted ours. They cited breach of contract based on harassment and discrimination by our personnel. They had every right to terminate the contract, sue us for damages, and publicly crucify us in the press." He straightened up, his expression shifting from anger to something that might have been disgust. The only reason we are not in court right now is because Dr. Ashford herself intervened. She asked her lawyers to stand down. She agreed to accept our apology and continue our business relationship." A tiny flicker of hope appeared in Garrison's eyes. If she had agreed to continue, if she had asked her lawyers to stand down, then perhaps— "Don't," Morrison said, reading his expression with unerring accuracy. "Don't you dare think that means you're getting away with this. She didn't forgive you, Bob. She didn't excuse you. She simply decided that a messy public lawsuit wasn't worth her time." He picked up the single piece of paper from his desk and held it out. "But she wanted accountability. She wanted a guarantee that no person flying on an Apex aircraft would ever experience what she did. And she made it very clear what that accountability looked like. Garrison took the paper with trembling hands. He didn't need to read it to know what it was, but his eyes scanned the words anyway, each one landing like a blow. Notice of termination. This letter serves as formal notification that your employment with Apex Aviation is terminated effective immediately for cause, specifically gross misconduct and passenger harassment. Your employment with Apex Aviation is terminated, Morrison stated flatly. Effective immediately. Garrison looked up from the letter, his face grey, his eyes hollow. "David," he whispered. "Please. 35 years. I've given 35 years to this industry. I've flown millions of miles without incident. I've never had a complaint, never had an accident, never had... 35 years of experience should have taught you wisdom and humility." Morrison cut him off, his voice like ice. Instead it bred arrogance and bigotry. You became complacent. You thought that uniform and that title made you a king. You thought your experience gave you the right to judge people based on how they looked, what they wore, the color of their skin. He shook his head slowly. "But you're not a king, Bob. You're an employee. And you just committed the cardinal sin. You cost the company. Not just money, but trust. Trust that took decades to build, and that you damaged in 5 minutes." Garrison felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He hadn't cried since his father's funeral 15 years ago. But now, sitting in this office watching his career crumble around him, he felt the moisture building. "I'll do anything," he said, his voice cracking. "Sensitivity training, a formal apology tour. I'll fly cargo routes to Alaska for a year. Please, David, please don't do this." Morrison looked at him with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. It was hard to tell. "It's too late for that, Bob. Dr. Ashford was very specific. She doesn't believe this is behavior that can be fixed with a corporate seminar or a written apology. She believes it's a matter of character, and she no longer has any faith in yours." He walked back to the window, his final words delivered to Garrison's reflection in the glass. "As part of our settlement with her, we have agreed to a full review and overhaul of our diversity and inclusion protocols led by a firm of her choosing. We have also agreed that you will never pilot another Apex aircraft again." He turned his head slightly. "But the consequences don't stop there, Bob. As required by FAA regulations and our own internal policies, a full report of this incident will be placed in your permanent file. When you apply for a job at NetJets FlexJet or any other reputable operator, they will see it. They will see that you were terminated for cause, due to gross misconduct and passenger harassment. They will see that you are a liability." His voice hardened. "Your career flying for the elite is over. You did this to yourself." He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Security will see you out." Robert Garrison sat there for a long moment, the termination letter crumpling slightly in his grip. The life he had built, the career he had cultivated, the prestige and respect and 6-figure salary, all of it had been wiped away. Not by a catastrophic accident, not by a mechanical failure, not by any of the 1,000 dangers that pilots faced every day. By 5 minutes of prejudice. By a judgment he had made in the space of a heartbeat. By a single terrible mistake. 2 security officers appeared at the door, their expressions professionally blank. They waited in silence as Garrison slowly, painfully rose from his chair. He didn't look at Morrison. He didn't make any final plea or protest. He simply gathered what remained of his dignity and walked toward the door, the termination letter still clutched in his hand. As he passed through the doorway, Morrison spoke one last time. "Bob." Garrison paused but didn't turn around. "She gave you every chance to stop, every opportunity to reconsider. She told you calmly and clearly that she was the passenger that the aircraft was chartered for her. And you didn't listen. You were so certain, so absolutely convinced that you knew better, that you couldn't hear what she was telling you. A pause. That's the part that I can't forgive. Not the prejudice, as ugly as it was. The certainty, the absolute refusal to consider that you might be wrong. Garrison stood there for a moment longer. Then, without a word, he continued through the door and let the security officers escort him away. Behind him, the door closed with a soft, final click. The world of private aviation is surprisingly small. Pilots, flight attendants, ground crew dispatchers, they all know each other or know someone who knows someone. They work the same routes, frequent the same FBOs, share the same layover hotels. Gossip travels through the community like electricity, through copper wire, instantaneous and unstoppable. Within 48 hours of Garrison's termination, everyone knew. The story spread through WhatsApp groups and Facebook pages, through conversations at airport bars and pilot lounges, through the informal networks that connected aviation professionals around the world. It was told and retold, embellished and expanded until it became something approaching legend. Did you hear about Garrison? The guy who tried to throw a billionaire off her own jet? I heard she owns the company, like the whole company. No, she owns the lease. But same difference, right? The guy called her an influencer's sugar daddy. He actually said that. To her face on the record. The flight attendant heard everything. Man 35 years down the drain. Just like that. The story took on different meanings depending on who was telling it. For some, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting bias cloud professional judgment. For others, it was a satisfying comeuppance proof that even the most arrogant old guard pilots weren't immune to consequences. For a few, it was a tragedy, the destruction of a distinguished career over what they saw as a single moment of poor judgment. But regardless of how it was interpreted, the story served one consistent purpose. It made Robert Garrison unemployable. His applications to other charter companies were met with swift, polite rejections. NetJets, the gold standard of fractional ownership programs, didn't even grant him an interview. FlexJet Wheels Up XO. Jet. Each one reviewed his application, noted the termination for cause in his record, and passed. The major commercial airlines weren't an option either. At 58, Garrison was too close to the mandatory retirement age of 65 to be worth the investment of training and certification. And besides, word had spread to those circles too. No one wanted to take a chance on a pilot whose name was synonymous with bias and unprofessionalism. 6 months after the incident in Aspen, Robert Garrison was a different man. The proud swagger that had characterized his movements for decades was gone, replaced by the stooped posture of someone carrying an invisible weight. His silver-gray hair, once cut in that precise military style, had grown shaggier, less maintained. The lines on his face had deepened, carved by stress and sleepless nights, and the relentless grinding of regret. He had been forced to sell the house in Connecticut. It was a beautiful home, a colonial revival on 2 acres of manicured lawn in a wealthy suburb where his neighbors were hedge fund managers and corporate executives. He and Margaret had raised their children. There had hosted holiday gatherings and summer barbecues, had built a life that seemed until very recently unshakable. But without his salary, without his benefits, without any realistic prospect of comparable employment, the mortgage became unsustainable. The legal fees from consulting with attorneys about potential appeals had eaten through his savings. The lifestyle they had maintained for decades was suddenly brutally beyond their means. The house sold for less than they had hoped. In a market that was cooling with the stigma of a distressed sale hanging over the transaction, they had to accept the best offer they received. Margaret took it hard. She had been a pilot's wife for 32 years, had built her social identity around the status that came with that role. She had served on charity boards and country club committees, had cultivated friendships with other pilots' wives, had enjoyed the travel benefits and the cocktail party conversations about exotic destinations and famous passengers. Now suddenly she was the wife of a disgraced former pilot, a man who had been fired for racism, a man whose name had become a punchline in the community that had once respected him. The distance between them grew. It started with small things, conversations that died in awkward silence, meals eaten separately, evenings spent in different rooms of their now rented apartment, she watching television in the living room while he stared at job listings on his laptop in the bedroom. Then, 3 months after the sale of the house, she told him she wanted a separation. "I can't do this anymore, Robert," she said, her voice tired and flat. "I can't watch you spiral. I can't keep explaining to my friends what happened. I can't keep pretending that everything is going to be okay when we both know it isn't." He didn't argue. He didn't fight. He simply nodded, accepting the verdict the way he had accepted all the others. The only job he could find was a cruel joke. A small freight company based out of a desolate airfield in Ohio needed pilots for their overnight cargo runs. The pay was a fraction of what he had earned at Apex. The aircraft was a 30-year-old Fairchild Metroliner, a cramped and noisy turboprop that bore no resemblance to the sleek Gulfstream he had once commanded. The routes were grueling red-eye flights to second-tier cities like Sioux Falls and Fargo and Peoria, hauling machine parts and medical supplies through the darkness. Instead of the serene luxury of a G650 cabin, his world was now the deafening roar of propeller engines and the smell of jet fuel and cardboard. Instead of Chloe offering chamomile tea and gourmet meals, his companion was a surly, overworked co-pilot named Hank, who chewed tobacco and communicated mainly in grunts. The glamour was gone. The prestige was gone. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, everything he had been was gone. One rainy Tuesday night, grounded in a dreary motel in Des Moines, due to mechanical issues with the aircraft, Garrison was scrolling through the news on his phone. It was a habit he had developed, a way of filling the empty hours between flights of feeling connected to a world that seemed to have moved on without him. He froze. There on the homepage of the Wall Street Journal was a picture of Dr. Vivian Ashford. She was standing at a podium, her hand raised in the air, a triumphant smile on her face. Behind her, the NASDAQ logo glowed in electric blue. The headline read, "Nexus soars, Ashford's biotech firm goes public in blockbuster IPO. Shares jump 70% on first day." He tapped on the article, his hand trembling slightly, and read, "Nexus Dynamics, the biotech company founded and led by Dr. Vivian Ashford, made a spectacular debut on the NASDAQ today, with shares surging 70% from their initial offering price. The company, which specializes in gene therapy treatments for hereditary conditions, is now valued at over $25 billion. Dr. Ashford, who retained a majority stake through the IPO, has joined the ranks of the world's youngest self-made billionaires. The offering was oversubscribed by more than 15 times, reflecting extraordinary investor confidence in the company's pipeline of treatments. "This is just the beginning," Dr. Ashford told reporters at the NASDAQ opening bell ceremony. "Our mission is to eliminate hereditary blindness within a generation. Today's milestone gives us the resources to pursue that goal with everything we have." The article continued detailing the company's breakthrough gene therapy, its Phase 3 clinical trial results, its partnerships with major research hospitals. There were photographs of Dr. Ashford with senators and scientists and philanthropists, images of a woman who was not just succeeding, but transforming the world. Garrison stared at her picture for a long time. She looked powerful, poised, confident, the same quiet certainty that he had mistaken for something else entirely, for arrogance, for deception, for the presumption of someone who didn't belong. She was exactly the same woman who had sat in that cream leather seat in Aspen. And he had looked at her and seen nothing. He had looked at one of the most accomplished, most brilliant, most transformative people on the planet, and he had seen a problem to be removed, an inconvenience, an imposter. The magnitude of his mistake, which he had understood intellectually, suddenly hit him emotionally. It wasn't just that he had been wrong about her identity. He had been wrong about everything. Wrong about what wealth looked like. Wrong about what power looked like. Wrong about his ability to judge people based on appearance. The world had moved on. Dr. Vivian Ashford was being celebrated on the cover of magazines and the homepages of financial news sites. She was changing medicine, saving lives, building a legacy that would outlast them both. And he was in a motel in Des Moines, Iowa, staring at water stains on the ceiling, waiting for the mechanics to fix a 30-year-old cargo plane. The karma wasn't just that he had lost his job. It wasn't just the house, the wife, the career, the status. It was something deeper, something more insidious. It was the knowledge. The inescapable, ever-present knowledge of who she was and what he had done. Of the opportunity he had squandered, the person he had dismissed, the future he had forfeited through nothing more than his own ugly assumptions. He tossed the phone onto the lumpy motel bedspread and stared up at the water-stained ceiling. The roar in his ears wasn't from the turboprop engines this time. It was the sound of his own monumental failure echoing through the empty chambers of his life. He had built his identity on being a man who could see everything from 45,000 feet. A pilot's vision trained to scan horizons and read instruments and navigate through clouds and darkness. But on the ground, when it mattered most, he had been completely, utterly blind. The conference room at Apex Aviation Headquarters was filled with sunlight. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Central Park, the trees now dressed in the vibrant greens of late spring. Around the polished mahogany table sat a collection of executives, lawyers, and diversity consultants, all focused on the woman at the head of the table. Dr. Vivian Ashford had not come to celebrate. She had come to build. The Ashford Initiative, David Morrison said. Standing at the front of the room with a presentation displayed on the screen behind him. Named with Dr. Ashford's permission after the incident that made its necessity undeniable. He clicked to the next slide, which displayed a comprehensive overview of the program's components. This is more than a diversity training program. It's a fundamental restructuring of how we approach passenger relations and crew conduct across every aircraft in our fleet. Vivian listened as Morrison outlined the details. Mandatory bias training for all crew members conducted quarterly rather than annually. Anonymous passenger feedback systems that would flag potential issues before they escalated. A passenger dignity fund to support travelers who experienced discrimination. Real-time reporting mechanisms that bypassed traditional chain-of-command delays. Zero-tolerance policies with immediate investigation protocols. It was comprehensive. It was well-funded. It was by any reasonable measure a genuine attempt to prevent what had happened in Aspen from ever happening again. But Vivian knew that policies, no matter how well designed, were only part of the solution. "I appreciate everything Apex is doing," she said, when Morrison finished his presentation. "But I want to go further." She stood walking to the window, looking out at the park below. Joggers circled the reservoir. Nannies pushed strollers along winding paths. The world continued its business, oblivious to the conversations happening in boardrooms 50 stories above. "The problem isn't just individual bias," she said, choosing her words carefully. "It's the pipeline. It's who gets into the industry in the first place. It's who sees themselves as pilots, as aviation professionals, as people who belong in these spaces." She turned back to the room. "I want to fund a scholarship program. Flight training for young people from underrepresented communities. Not charity. Investment. Building a future where the next generation of pilots looks different from the current one." The room was silent for a moment. Then Morrison nodded slowly. "Tell us more." Over the next hour, Vivian outlined her vision. The Wings of Change Scholarship would provide full funding for flight training from private pilot certification all the way through commercial ratings. Recipients would be selected based on merit and potential, with a focus on candidates who had overcome significant obstacles to pursue their dreams. The program would start small, perhaps 20 students in the first year. But it would grow. It would expand. It would become a model that other companies, other industries could adapt and replicate. If Captain Garrison couldn't see past his assumptions, Vivian said, "Then we need to build an industry where those assumptions don't exist. Where a young black woman sitting in the owner's seat isn't unusual. Where diversity isn't an exception, it's the norm." 6 months later, the results were already visible. The first class of Wings of Change scholars had begun their training at flight schools across the country. 52 young people from backgrounds as diverse as the communities they represented were learning to fly. 4 of them had already soloed. 1 had been accepted to the Air Force Academy. Leo Martinez, the first officer who had tried to intervene in Aspen, had been promoted to captain. He had become the public face of Apex's transformation, speaking at industry conferences about the moment he chose to speak up. "I could have stayed silent," he told one audience, his voice steady with conviction. "I could have let it happen and looked the other way. But silence is complicity. Dr. Ashford taught me that." Standing there in that cabin, watching her maintain her composure while a man tried to strip her of her dignity, I learned something I'll never forget. We all have a choice. Every day, in every situation, we have a choice about who we're going to be. The Ashford Initiative expanded beyond Apex Aviation. Other charter companies began adopting similar protocols. The FAA acknowledged the program as a model for the industry. Vivian was invited to speak at aviation conferences around the world, not about her experience, but about the future. She accepted every invitation. Not because she wanted recognition, not because she needed validation, but because every speech, every panel, every conversation was an opportunity to push for change, to move the needle, to ensure that what happened in that cabin in Aspen would never happen again. The ripples continued to spread, and with each one the industry became a little bit better. The Gulfstream GC650 sliced through the darkness at 45,000 feet, below the vast black expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, stretched to every horizon invisible except for the occasional glimmer of moonlight on distant waves. Above, the stars blazed with a brilliance impossible to see from the light-polluted ground, a river of diamonds scattered across black velvet. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was one of quiet productivity. Dr. Vivian Ashford sat in her customary seat, the same cream leather chair where she had sat on that afternoon in Aspen 1 year ago. A tablet on her lap displayed the final draft of her keynote address for the World Health Innovators Summit in Geneva. The speech was about the ethical imperatives of gene editing technology, a topic that wrestled with nothing less than the future of humanity. Across the polished mahogany table, Samuel Reed was reviewing quarterly projections on his own tablet. At 68, with kind eyes and silver hair that gave him an air of distinguished wisdom, Samuel had been Vivian's mentor since her postdoctoral days. He understood both the science and the soul of the company she had built. The flight crew was a study in unobtrusive professionalism. Captain Eva Rodriguez, whose calm competence had been a welcome balm after that day in Aspen, was at the controls. The flight attendant, a polished and intuitive man named Ben, had anticipated every need without being asked, then retreated to the galley to give them privacy. This was how it was supposed to be. This was what professional service looked like. Samuel set his tablet down and looked at Vivian, who had paused her work to gaze out the window. Her reflection stared back, a faint silhouette, against the deep star-dusted indigo of the night sky. "A penny for your thoughts," Samuel said gently. "You've been staring at the void for 10 minutes. That's usually a sign you've either solved cold fusion or you're troubled. Vivian turned a slow, thoughtful smile, touching her lips. Neither, thankfully. I was just thinking about this plane, about how different the air feels in here now. It's strange, isn't it? How a space can hold the memory of a conflict. Samuel nodded with understanding. The unpleasantness in Aspen. You could call it that. Vivian picked up her water glass, swirling the contents absently. I received an email from David Morrison this morning. It was the one-year follow-up on the new protocols they implemented across the Apex fleet. He said the internal metrics on personnel conduct and client satisfaction have improved dramatically. He should be grateful, Samuel observed. You saved his company from a reputational disaster and gave him the blueprint to fix it. That's more than most clients would have done. Vivian set the glass down and met Samuel's gaze. He mentioned Robert Garrison at the end of the email. He felt I had a right to know what became of him. Samuel leaned forward, his curiosity evident. It's not a happy story, Vivian said, her voice devoid of any triumph. He's flying an old cargo plane out of Ohio now, night routes to second-tier cities. According to David, the man lost everything of consequence. His career in private aviation was obliterated as we expected. The financial strain led to him losing his house. His wife, unable to cope with the fall from their social standing, left him a few months ago. She paused, gathering her thoughts. David's last line was, "He is by all accounts a broken man." Samuel considered her words carefully. "And how do you feel about that?" Vivian looked out the window again at the stars, at the darkness, at the vast distance between where she sat and the ground below. The thing is, Samuel, I feel absolutely no joy in hearing it. No sense of victory, no vindictive pleasure. She turned back to face him. Just a profound and quiet sadness for the sheer, pointless waste of it all. Samuel studied her expression. You're sad for him? No, Vivian corrected, shaking her head. Not for him. For the situation. For the fact that a man could reach his late 50s with all the experience of a life lived and still possess a worldview so cramped and poisoned by prejudice. Her voice softened. He didn't just fail to see me, Samuel. He failed to see the world as it actually is. He built his own prison of bigotry brick by brick over decades. He was convinced it was a fortress protecting him from threats. But it was just a cage of his own making. She took a breath. All I did was show him it had no door. He was already trapped inside. He had been trapped for years. The cabin was quiet for a moment. The only sound was the soft hum of the engines, the gentle whisper of air flowing over the wings. I never wanted to ruin his life, Vivian continued. My goal wasn't his destruction. But I've replayed that day 1,000 times, and I would do the exact same thing again, every single time. She looked at Samuel directly. Does that make me ruthless? Samuel shook his head slowly. No, Vivian. That makes you a leader. He leaned forward, his voice firm and reassuring. What you did wasn't personal. It was principled. There's a world of difference. Men like Garrison, the old guard, the gatekeepers, they operate on a currency of intimidation and exclusion. They expect to be deferred to. They expect their assumptions to go unchallenged. For years, people did exactly that. They swallowed the insult, apologized for the inconvenience of their own existence, and quietly deplaned. He gestured around the luxurious cabin. But you held a different currency. Power backed by principle. You forced a reckoning he had avoided his entire life. He paused, letting his words sink in. This plane, your company, your wealth, it's all a form of power. And power is useless if it's only used for comfort and convenience. Its true value is in its application. That day you applied your power not to punish a man, but to protect a principle. The principle that dignity is not contingent on fitting someone's profile. A soft chime filled the cabin. Dr. Ashford, Mr. Reed. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. This is Ava. We're just passing over the coast of France and beginning our initial descent toward Geneva. Ground time is estimated at 25 minutes. Weather is clear and you should have a beautiful view of the Alps on approach. Thank you, Captain Vivian replied, pressing the intercom button. The conversation shifted the intensity of the reflection, giving way to the reality of their arrival. Below them, the jagged, moonlit peaks of the Alps began to emerge from the darkness, a breathtaking landscape of stone and ice. The scattered lights of remote villages gave way to the glowing, intricate web of Geneva nestled around its lake. Vivian watched the city grow closer, her mind connecting Samuel's words to the view below. She hadn't just been defending her own dignity that day. She had been clearing a flight path. She had been using her altitude to create a higher standard. A standard that would apply not just to her, but to everyone who came after her. Everyone who might board a plane or enter a boardroom or walk into a space where they were told they didn't belong. The incident with Captain Garrison was no longer a dark memory of conflict. It was a crucible, a defining moment that had tested her resolve and solidified her understanding of her place in the world. The wheels touched the runway with a gentle kiss. Vivian gathered her papers. She was no longer just the brilliant scientist or the savvy CEO. She was a steward of the power she had earned, a pilot of change in a world that desperately needed a new course. Her journey was far from over, but as she prepared to step out into the cool Swiss night to share her vision for the future, she knew with unshakable certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The story of Dr. Vivian Ashford and Captain Robert Garrison is a reminder that in our world, prejudice doesn't just wound hearts. It shatters careers, it upends lives, it destroys everything a person has built in the space of a single terrible decision. Captain Garrison looked at a brilliant scientist, a transformative leader, a woman who was literally working to cure blindness, and he saw nothing. He saw athletic leggings instead of achievement. He saw a cashmere hoodie instead of a Harvard degree. He saw the color of her skin and decided in that moment that she couldn't possibly be the person in charge. And he paid for that blindness with everything he had. His career, his home, his marriage, his future. All of it gone, not because of bad luck, not because of circumstances beyond his control, but because of a choice he made, a judgment he rendered, a profile he created in his mind, and then refused to question, even when the evidence was staring him in the face. Dr. Ashford, on the other hand, showed us what true leadership looks like. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She didn't lose her composure or her dignity, even when a man was threatening to have her arrested on her own aircraft. She stood her ground with quiet confidence. She used her power not for revenge, but for accountability. She forced an entire industry to become better, not through anger, but through principle. She proved that real authority isn't found in a uniform or a title. It's found in character, in integrity, in the willingness to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been told you didn't belong? Have you ever walked into a room and felt someone's eyes sweep over you? Judging you, dismissing you, deciding that you weren't worth their time. If you have, I want you to remember this story. Remember that Dr. Vivian Ashford was told she didn't fit the profile. And she went on to become a billionaire who is changing the face of medicine. Remember that she didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She didn't need to show her Forbes profile or recite her credentials. She simply knew who she was, and she refused to let anyone diminish her. And if you've ever looked at someone and made an assumption, if you've ever judged a book by its cover, decided what someone was worth based on how they looked or what they wore, let this story be a lesson. The next person you dismiss might be the person who holds the keys to your future. The next person you underestimate might be the one signing the checks. Remember this. Your seat isn't given, it's earned. And no one has the right to take it from you. The next time someone tells you that you don't fit the profile, let them underestimate you. Let them make their assumptions. Let them think they know exactly who you are and what you're capable of. And then show them exactly who signs the checks. If this story moved you, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that like button. Let us know this story resonated with you. Every like helps more people discover these powerful messages of justice and accountability. Second, subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell. We bring you stories like this every week. Stories of dignity, stories of justice, stories of people who refused to be diminished by those who underestimated them. Don't miss a single one. And third, share this video. Send it to a friend. Post it on your social media. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because you never know who might be going through something similar, who might need this reminder that they belong exactly where they are. Drop a comment below and tell us your story. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever been judged before you opened your mouth? We want to hear from you. This community is built on your voices, your experiences, your truth. Until next time, stay kind, stay just, and never ever underestimate the power of standing your ground with grace. Thank you for watching.